our speaker, Helen Kessler, to the virtual stage. Helen is president of HJKessler Associates, a sustainable design consulting firm founded in 2003, and she's a principal with Upfront Regenerative Design. With over 35 years in sustainable design and energy efficiency, she is passionate about connecting the dots, recognizing complex systems such as the stakeholders can identify solutions that work for all. And she specializes in the use of an integrative design approach that has a leading role on over 80 diverse lead projects. I'd like to now hand over the mic to Helen. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I want to thank Mark Edelman as well. Mark and I have known each other for a long time, and so it's really a pleasure to be speaking with you guys. And I have actually spoken to IFMA Chicago previously, many years ago, and so this is great to be back. I am really thrilled to be talking about regenerative development and this idea of a living systems approach. My presentation, to a certain extent, is relating to new buildings, new projects, but it really doesn't have to. The whole idea of regenerative development is it can be used in this living systems approach, can be used for anything. And in fact, some of you may have seen an article that I wrote for Building Operating Management some years ago about specifically for facility managers. So anybody interested in doing that can find that online. Well, we've got a lot of issues going on in the world, as all of you know, and the planet is certainly, unfortunately, becoming more and more unsustainable, and it's in large part because of us. You know, what we do and what we've been bringing forth, but that doesn't mean that we can't make some changes. And the idea behind regeneration is actually looking at how do we regenerate our communities and our ecosystems to deal with things like climate change and climate migration and the various issues of resource depletion and water scarcity, and as well as all the things that we're all experiencing with regard to climate change and glaciers melting, floods, tornadoes, etc. One of the questions I like to think about is, what would it take to create a truly sustainable future for our world? Not building at all. Well, that would be actually a really good place to start. I mean, we're talking so much about building to net zero energy, but is that good enough? Or net zero waste, is that good enough? So the question is, what is good enough? And when we talk about, I'll talk a little bit more about sustainability in a minute, but when we talk about sustainability, what are we sustaining? What are we sustaining? Can we start looking at shifting our mindset from thinking in terms of all the technologies that we have used and that we've created to make better lives, and start thinking about how we can work with what we're doing using a living systems approach. And so that's the idea behind this presentation, is to give you an idea of what that could look like. So this is an idea of a trajectory of ecological design. And on the left-hand side, we see degenerating. On the right-hand side, we see regenerating. And in the middle, we see sustainable, and green is really still on the degenerating side. It's not on making things much better. It's actually keeping things from getting less bad. And so sustainability, in a sense, has been misused. I mean, the question is, what are we sustaining? Are we sustaining the status quo? Are we sustaining something better? We have to include in regeneration sustainability. Sustainability, the definitions of sustainability at one time, and I think we've kind of forgotten them, is to design and create our communities so that they are sustainable and give back to the next generations what we have. Think of this as a large ecology and looking at everything all together. The regenerating side is a living systems framework, and the degenerating side is more of a technical framework. So on the regenerating side, we're thinking in terms of qualitative and patterns and living whole systems. And on the degenerating side, we're looking at technical systems design. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need all of this. It's not that we can just do one and not the other, but if we only do work on the technical side and forget about the living system side, we are continuing to degenerate and see the kinds of issues that I mentioned early on in this presentation. I'm going to introduce this idea of regeneration in another way. And we actually look at regeneration from a number of what we call first principles. And these first principles are illustrated here. And what I'm intending to do with this presentation is actually take us through not all of these, but most of these first principles and show some examples. And then we're going to use the project that you just talked about in your breakout group to think about, use that project as you're listening and to think about how you might possibly change the way you approach the project using these ideas. So one of the basic premises of regeneration is to think in wholes or think of wholes versus thinking of parts. So that funny looking duck on the left was a drawing by Descartes, and looking at, well, what's the function of a duck? And, you know, this is the duck's digestive system. And can you imagine, you know, having a digestive system as a component, you know, made up of technical components like this? But, you know, we do this similar kind of thing with frogs. Remember your biology class when you dissected a frog and you took it apart and you took the legs off, and through that, you really, I hope you agree, I mean, you lose the essence of what a frog is. It can no longer, and there's no way you could ever put it back together again and have frog again. So in regeneration, we want to think of wholes. And we also want to think of wholes nested within wholes, So this frog is nested in the ecosystem of the lily pad or the lily pond. And you can imagine also that the frog has cells which are nested within the frog. You know, actually all of the different systems within the frog are nested within each other. And that goes for us, it goes for everything. It goes also for our cities. You know, if you think of the buildings in our cities, are wholes nested within the whole of the city, nested within the whole of the region, nested within the whole of the US and the planet. And you could go back and forth and make it bigger or smaller, but so the idea of a whole is a whole system, something that can work on its own, so getting back to the frog, the leg of the frog is not a whole. The leg of the frog is the leg of the frog. The frog itself is a whole. It can manage on its own. You could also take a look at an automobile. An automobile is a whole, but the parts and pieces, maybe a tire is a whole, but if you wanted to if you got all the best parts and pieces of a car from, you know, like the best parts of a Rolls Royce and the best parts of a Chevy and the best parts of a Porsche and the best parts of a Ford and put them all together, you wouldn't have a car. So, and the other thing that we look at is the essence. What is the essence of a place? And we start with actually understanding through regeneration and living systems. We really want to understand what is this place that we're working with, and actually go through a process to do that. So again, like with essence, every place has its own essence. It's not necessarily the role that it has, but it's like, what is the essence? And I think you can, if you think about children, even let's say twins, each twin would have his or her own essence. You think about your friends, and everybody has their own essence. Think about a city, think about a neighborhood in the city, the neighborhood of Lakeview versus the neighborhood of downtown Chicago or Bronzeville. Each of these places have their own essence. And I think sometimes it's hard to actually say, well, this is the essence of that place. But when we just create an image of that, we see it and we can feel that. So in understanding all of that and looking at the story, the place, we can look at projects nested within their neighborhoods, nested within the community or the region or the watershed, so everything is interconnected. And you might want to say, well, why do we care about this? Well, let me just talk about a project that was done by some friends of mine. This is this is just an example. You could imagine there are other kinds of examples as well. This happens to be an eco resort. What the owner of this eco resort said to the designers is, I don't want to just build a resort. I want a place that is going to have an impact on the community. I want a place that's going to essentially regenerate that community and make everything more sustainable. And so they brought together a group called Regenerative that did a study of this place, and they found out a bunch of things. When they found out one of the things they found out was this community in which this eco resort was to be built wasn't doing that well, and people were leaving the community. There wasn't a lot of employment in that area, and the ecosystems were degrading. And through actually doing that study of place, they started to discover, well, what could we do to actually start to regenerate this place? And they started doing things like there's an estuary here, dredging the estuary in such a way that the shrimp started coming back and other animals started coming back and the mangroves started growing back again. But that wasn't all that they were doing. They were also looking at, it turns out there was salt, they were mining artisanal salt, or making artisanal salt from the salt mines nearby. They also were still working with the community to grow organic vegetables. And through all of these efforts, they actually created a greater community where the community started beginning to thrive, and they started looking at how can we make this community even stronger. And they focused on education and health and economic development. So at the end of the day, this eco resort wasn't just about building a resort, it was about building a community, an ecosystem, and everything that worked together. And one of the results which they loved was the fact that the teenagers who were all wanting to move out started to stay there. And they actually worked with the community in such a way that the community and the guests at the resort started working together. One of the things they had at this community was a volunteer turtle nursery. I mean, obviously the turtles were just living there, but the people would come and volunteer to help support the turtles in their to thrive. So what made me excited about this project was just the fact that it wasn't just a fabulous, wonderful place to stay with super green buildings, very low energy, capturing the wastewater and reusing wastewater, actually improving the whole water ecology in the area, but actually rebuilding that community. And so that's the idea behind regeneration, that you actually are rebuilding community. Regeneration is one of the principles of regeneration is to look for potential rather than just solving problems. And we are all trained to solve problems, but how could we actually solve problems in a way that isn't really about solving them, but about looking for the potential? And I want to tell you a story. So there's something in regeneration, and this is not just for regenerative development, this is for anything that we do. You know, we so often, when there's something that's going on, and there's something that's activating and something that's restraining, we come to a compromise. And the idea here is thinking of it differently and looking very closely at what is activating our what we want to do, are the restraints, and how can we come to a reconciliation. We call that the law of three. And some years ago, I heard a presentation by Ben Cohn of Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. And this was, he was telling a story about how they had become very successful, and they decided, and they had always wanted to give back to the community. And they thought, okay, well, we'll create a foundation, Ben and Jerry's Foundation, to give back to the community. Well, it turned out that that wasn't working too well for them. They created that foundation, but then they had two jobs. They had to make ice cream, and they had to work on this foundation. So that was the restraint. It was just got to be too much. And around that same time, they heard about the cutting down of the rainforests. And they went, well, what's in the rainforest? You know, what kind of plants are there that maybe we could use? And they heard about Brazil nuts. And out of that, they thought, well, if we were to buy the Brazil nuts and use them to make a new ice cream, Rainforest Crunch, they could actually take care of both their activating force, the wanting to do good, the restraining force of not enough time, and reconcile that into creating new ice cream. And so they actually support the rainforest, and at the same time use the materials from the rainforest to create the new ice cream. They did the same thing with one of their other flavors, which has brownies in it. And they use brownies that are made by ex-convicts. So the idea here is not to compromise, but to look at potential and a reconciliation. And then another idea of regeneration, and this is, I know I'm throwing a lot of ideas at you guys, and I'm hoping for a few questions. We can also look at who needs to be part of whatever we're working on. And I think about the projects that I work on, which are mostly LEED sustainability type projects, and we're all talking about, you know, the building and the equipment and HVAC systems, and how much does it cost. We talk a little bit about natural capital because we want to make sure that whatever we do is good for the environment. But the fact is that, you know, we're not talking, you know, if we're thinking about these nested systems, we're not talking about the bigger environment. We're just talking about the environment in the building. So if we can start looking at, well, what is genuine wealth? What is genuine wealth based on? Who should be representing the social capital and the human capital and the natural capital, as well as the financial and produced capital in our projects? How would that bring together all of these systems to create something that would actually ongoingly regenerate the community? Some other principles of regeneration include the importance of developing a community will. So we need to actually, in regeneration, it can't stop with a building. It can't stop with a project. You know, that the ecosystem, or that Playa Viva project that I showed you, that project became a catalyst for community development that is ongoing. And so all of this is about actually developing the people who are involved in the community. And so I like to think when we're looking at that nested system diagram of the project within the community, within the greater whole, that the community actually is affecting the project, and the project is affecting the community and beyond. And so that's something that is ongoing and continues to change and continues to develop. And really, development is the word here. So there's no, as it says here, there's no end game. And we want to get together and get everyone's input, you know, genuine wealth, and to attempt to abandon our preconceived notions. One of the things that we like to say when we talk about regeneration is accept nothing that I've said without checking it on against your own experience, but reject nothing that I'm saying again, without looking at, what we're talking about in your own experience, and actually try to come to these ideas with a new mind. So this was a project that was worked on by a friend of mine in Brattleboro, Vermont. And Regenerative, the same company that worked on the Playa Viva, was asked to come here and work with the Brattleboro Co-op to help them build an energy efficient LEED Gold grocery store. They were also asked to do a study of the environment. You can see this beautiful area, and there were farms and this little village. So they did all that. And when they started, they did a workshop with the co-op folks. They said, before we get into this workshop in detail, let's, if you don't mind, go on a tour of the grocery store. And so, the grocery store, the co-op wants to make themselves as sustainable as possible. They go through the shop and they start picking up things like grapes from Chile and sardines from Thailand, and looking at all of the stuff and realizing that the average distance for the produce that comes to and the food that comes to this co-op was coming from 1,500 to 3,000 miles away. And so my friend asked, well, what happens if there's a trucker strike and you can't get anything? How does that make this, make this sustainable? Anyway, so the co-op said, you know what, we just want to leave gold grocery store go away. They went away for about a year. They ended up being invited back because the co-op realized how important it was to look at their building within the nested system of that community, within the nested system of that farming area. And they started working with the farmers to actually, the farming community, the farming areas had become quite degraded over time and were not producing well. And they started looking at regenerative agriculture. They started looking also at where was the best soil in this area. And it turned out it was in people's backyards. And so the co-op took advantage of all of that and created themselves as not just a grocery store, but also a community center. And my favorite part of this story, in a way, is that years later, after this was done, I was visiting a friend of mine who's the president of her co-op in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she said, the Brattleboro Co-op, oh my God, that's the model for co-ops. We all go visit that co-op because they've done such a great job. So here you can see that it's not just about a building. And that both of these examples, I wanted to make it clear that it's really about community. And you can look at anything that you're working on, even within, whether you're in an existing facility, and look at it the same way. So going back just to reiterate, these are the first principles of regeneration. We've talked about working in holes and nested holes. We've talked about value-adding roles to a certain extent and looking at genuine wealth. We talked about understanding the essence of a place and working with potential, not problems, with that law of three, and developing the capacity of the humans within that those systems. So at this point, I'm curious to know who has questions or reflections.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Helen. Thank you very much. This is so interesting. Helen, how often, I noticed in your capitals, finance was one of the points of the star. And if you were to give each of those points on the star a size by ranking, by what was most important as you move through it, do they all change according to who the client is? And how do you not let financial stymie your efforts to bring in sustainability?
You know what? All of this takes a lot of intentionality. And I mean, that's a great question, because I find for my own projects that it's really hard to bring all of it in, because I tend to actually work with architects, other architects, and to then say, look, I want to have the community involved in this is difficult. And yet, the most successful projects I've worked on, the community has been involved in those projects. So, you know, wouldn't want to put a weighting on any of it. I would say, start with the holes and look at, you know, if you can, at a minimum, look at beyond just the project that you're working on to the next level, and start there in terms of thinking about the and understanding the place and understanding who's involved. That will help. But, you know, the question you're asking is a difficult one to answer for, you know, in general. But thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
In your experience, Helen, what stakeholders have you seen really interested in doing a more of a regenerative approach?
I'm actually really excited that I expect to be working on a project, in fact, in Chicago, where we will be doing that, because the project owner wants to make sure that they get the community involved in the project. And so, and they are actually bringing in some folks who are going to do work with the community to understand this place. So that's one area where, you know, an owner might be really interested in that.
Okay.
But another area which my friends at Regenerative talk about is where they've worked with developers who want to get projects done more quickly. And the only way, so these are projects which have huge resistance from the community. And so by using this kind of process, they can actually get to the actually building the project more quickly, because they're including the community in the conversations early on in a particular way, to understand how it's not just about we want community input and then we're going to do whatever we want. We want community input because we're going to use that community input.
Helen, along with that same topic that Christian asked as well. Community input has, I love the concept, but it also kind of waves a little red flag too. How do you avoid letting special interest groups slow down or even derail a project?
I suspect that in most cases, those special interests are going to try to derail the project. That's inevitable. So then the question is, how do you get them on board to what you're working on? So that, you know, like, get them excited about this idea of potential. You know, those groups are the ones that create, you know, the activating or the restraining, you know, they're the activating. You're trying to restrain whatever it is. Your goal is not to compromise with them, but to actually look at how you can bring that activating force into your project to actually make it better for everybody.
Helen, it's Carl. I couldn't agree wholeheartedly. We're working on a very controversial project, and it's really an education process for all the stakeholders, which are the general public, plus the government, et cetera. And, you know, there's a lot of preconceptions of these special interest groups that just are wrong, and you try to educate them. So it's really tough. But I was going to ask you, there's a scorecard called the ESG scorecard. Are you familiar with that? Can you kind of talk about that?
Oh my God, there's so many different, no, I'm personally not in.
Well, this ESG, I think it's happening in Europe. It's called environmental, social, and governance.
Yeah.
So it's talking about this holistic regenerative approach to real estate value.
Yeah.
So the scorecard actually is used by financial institutions in terms of value of the built environment.
So I'm going to disabuse you of that being regenerative. A scorecard is never regenerative.
Well, it takes into account the social aspects, but also the governance of the companies. So it's
Well, it's a great start, and I'm certainly familiar with that concept. I'm just not familiar with that specific scorecard. But I would caution you to not, like LEAD was originally designed to create sustainability practices, but in fact, it has to a very large extent become just a scorecard. And so we need to be very cognizant that if we start thinking about things in terms of these bigger systems and the holes in the systems, we can use the scorecard, but the scorecard can't be the be all and end all. Maybe use the scorecard later to see how you're doing, but not or how you did, so to speak. I don't know. I'm not really answering your question, Carl, because I kind of reacted to you saying that it was regenerative, and I'm going, no.
No, you reacted to scorecard, but it is something that's moving very fast.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, all of this, and that is exciting. And I don't want to say it's bad and wrong and something. I'm just saying it's not this. That's all. But yeah, I think it's great when a company is looking beyond their own immediate interests to looking at how they can include the community and looking at how they can look at the bigger picture. And if that's the way that they're going to do it, it's better than, in my opinion, not doing anything.
Okay, if there's no more questions, then I'd like to thank Helen for being our speaker today. We would like to thank each of you for joining us today, and Helen for sharing her expertise and knowledge with us. A $25 donation will be made to the IFMA Foundation in your honor. And to date, our donations have been over $4,400. So this concludes our program, and we hope to see all of you at an upcoming event soon. Thank you.